So in the leaflet that was put out, it was said that we would discuss order, creativity, and dialogue. Now, when we talked it over, it appeared that some of the notions I was thinking of, order that I was thinking of discussing, might be not suitable for a group of this kind, perhaps a bit too technical, but so we may have to change it to discuss some other things. We hope to get to creativity, and we will discuss dialogue and something about order, but perhaps not it may not be exactly what you were led to expect in the leaflet. Now, I have sort of a general notion of what I would like to, what I'd like to have us discuss here, but I think it's very useful if people will begin by either asking questions or saying something as to what they thought would be discussed here. This is useful not only to me to see what people are thinking, how to make contact, but also for the group, so that people will get a better feeling for what the mind of the group is. Because one of the things we hope to aim for is at least to explore the notion of dialogue, where we might hope to have a common mind in the group, or at least to begin that, right? And perhaps if we could begin now, just if people would raise questions or say something. And let me also say that I wish you would talk loud, because I have some blockage of the ear and I'm not hearing normally for the moment. And so that would help.
Krishnamurti expressed that I think there were 4 factors involved in communication, just to begin with. So if there isn't going to be any communication, there isn't much dialogue. How about that? I mean, these 4 conditions apparently have to be met, and they're rather stringent. It makes things difficult.
What are the 4 conditions?
I think I have to ask my wife. But the idea was that the people have to be pretty well on the same level. In other words, the same general type of consciousness and so on. In all 4 cases, that's what it amounted to.
Yes.
The people have to be alike.
Yes, I can't remember exactly. They have to meet at the same level at the same time. And some other... What?
But do they have to begin?
Well, that's what we must explore. We may find out that we are not at the same level, right? Then what will we do?
That's why I brought it up.
What?
I said, that's why I brought it up.
Uh-huh. Good. Yeah, so that's one point then.
I would think that people being here at a school which was started by Krishnamurti probably all have in common some interest in what is the meaning of life, what is man's place in the universe, what is consciousness, what is intelligence. You, having an extensive background in theoretical physics, have been looking into what is the nature of the universe, presumably throughout your career. And it seems obvious that the two are related. Any kind of religious inquiry which is not able to stand the test of scientific insight or scientific analysis would not be very valid. So your particular expertise in the area of the basic questions of physics which apply to us all.
Yes. Well, you think it would be useful to discuss the general worldview as implied by physics.
I think that might be very interesting.
That is one approach which I have adopted in some dialogues of this nature. We were discussing whether I should, and some people felt that it might be a little too technical for some members of the group and less technical for others. But so that is a question. Perhaps we'll leave it open. But I mean, that's the sort of question that people are worried about. Huh? But one point you can make is that the worldview which we have has a tremendous effect on everything we do in our whole being, and we may try to bring that out. also on meaning. And relevant to that is that the modern worldview of cosmology and the notion of physics tends to suggest an immense mechanical universe in which everything is sort of moving by blind forces, in which the human being has almost no place, right? As opposed to the older idea where it seemed there was a well-organized universe with God, as they say, God in his heavens and all's right with the world. And the thing, therefore, everything has its place and its meaning, right? Now, that view may seem attractive in some ways, but it also had some very unpleasant features because it led to a very authoritarian structure with restricted people a great deal. Now we have another view which allows for more openness, but also it becomes more meaningless, right?
In terms of external meanings that were attributed in the past.
Yes. But I mean, we might keep all that in mind then, you see. That's one of the concerns of some people in the group, right? And shall we proceed then?
I would ask about the investigations that you've done, and I know this is admittedly technical, about the speed of light as it relates to quantum physics, and whether or not in the quantum netherworld or wholeness, depending upon the terminology, whether that the restriction imposed by moving something at the speed of light, what that relationship is to consciousness and the structure of it.
Yes, well, that might be an interesting question about the relation of the speed of light to consciousness, but again, it might be rather technical. I think that question could be a little too technical for this group, you see. But it would be more appropriate in a group that was more oriented toward physics or science, where people would have some background.
I wonder if we could talk about the nature of insight, that the actual observation changes, very active observation changes what we observe, what's observed.
Yes.
In that relationship.
Yes, the insight changes the whole mind, the whole brain, right? The way we observe. And also lack of insight can do it. Right? In a destructive way. I mean, or else false, that's something that might come up, false assumptions.
How do we move from thinking about it and talking about it to actually having insight into what we're doing here? So we're actually, what we see brings about a change in us. Not just more theory or not just talking about something.
Yes, okay, that's a thing that we would like to, it would be important to not merely to talk about all these things, but to participate in such a way that something would actually happen to us. Right? Yeah. Whether that's possible or not, I don't know, but that would be one of the things that might come out of a good dialogue. Right?
Well, there are two aspects in this conversation, this dialogue that you had with Krishnamurti. There seems to be partial insights, and that all of us, I claim, have had thousands of. And this flash, you say, oh yes, and then suddenly you understand something. And then Krishnamurti seemed to be holding out for the big one, which is the total insight, and that's it. Well, most of us haven't had the big one, I presume. And so that it seems to me that the partial insight then is the hope of mankind. In other words, if something doesn't change us, if we're going to just continue in the same more or less animalistic way as we have been for the next 3 million as we have for the last 3 million, we aren't going to get anywhere. Just more wars and more superficial cleverness.
Yes, well, I mean, many questions are involved there. We have going on with the old ways of the animalistic or Stone Age. We go on with the same problems, though they're getting worse because technology is presenting us with great dangers. That is, with that same mentality, we may become very destructive, and in many ways. So not only with war, but with destroying the nature and so on. And therefore, it seems urgent that we address this question, and not just for ourselves, but for the whole of humanity, and also in that context, the life of the individual will lose its meaning. Right? We connect up with meaning. Right? If we're thinking that it's all going on the same old way, eventually toward destruction. Right?
Do you think it would be practical to get the insights of the past? In other words, we have quite a literature of marvelous thinking, wisdom, and so on that has been handed down, and we try to do this, I suppose, in the universities and so on, is to get the best of this in the hopes that it will, I suppose, assist with further insight.
Yes, well, I think we have a question of what are the insights of the past, but what is the actual movement of act of insight? You see, we must distinguish that let's say, I don't know, who do we want to say, Buddha or Plato or somebody had a great insight in the past, and now we may, to some extent, participate in that, by understanding it. But another question is, what is the real nature of insight itself? Not this insight or that insight, but insight, right?
Well, I seem to be getting into this, but I suppose anybody chime in here. See, one of the, all right, if we got that there are yea many conditions involved that seem to provide all right, we try to provide an atmosphere or an environment within which insight most readily occurs. Now, to me, that is the definition of a school, is that environment within which insights most readily occur, just to start with.
Yes. So we may have to discuss that. What favors insight, do you see?
That's right.
If can we define that and so on?
It seems to make sense to me. I may be wrong, but if we take one thing, whatever it is, creativity or fear or disorder or something, and keep going with that and not get distracted and fragmented, but to keep trying to move through into something, and then in that movement through it, that we really have insight into it as we go, and that we're all moving with that one direction, so to speak.
It seems that a question that creates space is necessary for insight. That a question that creates a condition in the mind where there isn't an immediate knee-jerk reaction.
Yes, what do you mean by creating space?
In emptiness, something where the mind isn't quickly responding to the question.
Yeah.
Topographically.
Right. All right, so we'll be moving on whatever question we're investigating, and you're saying we don't jump in too fast, right? That would hold for a dialogue too, right? You see, very often people feel the urge to come in very fast to be sure that it's not too late to say what they have to say. And if there's a kind of pressure, and if everybody's working very fast, then the conditions of our communication are not right. So, therefore, there has to be a certain suspension. Not to move too fast. You have to find out then, of course, go into that why we do go too fast and so on.
Don't the associations from the past then tend to come in, and we're dealing with dead information from the past rather than reaching out into the unknown, which might possibly lead to insight.
Yes, okay. So there are certain pressures coming from the past which drive us too fast, right? Does anybody else want to contribute?
I would like to say, what can help the common intention of the group?
What?
What can help the common intention of the group to come together for the common intention and the intensity of the intention? So one is the intention, and the other is the intensity of the intention. We may have with some people the common intention, but not necessarily the same intensity of the intention. What can help to bring that common intention out, to awaken it, to make it alive?
Yes, how can we develop together a common intensity? Or, also, if there is not this intensity, why is it not there, right?
Yes.
Well, you had a...
Well, the comment was to this gentleman's remark, but actually it can also have something to do with what this lady said, which is with intensity or intention. I think that one of the reasons that communications go too fast is that people's what happens is they're not acknowledged. People do not give the talker or the speaker the intention, so that they feel that they have been listened to, and so that then the person who was speaking needs to feel from the person to whom he's speaking that he has received the message and can return it. And I think people tend to speed up when they don't get a fulfilled communication cycle. And they feel that they have to get it out because they get cut short frequently. And I think the intensity would come when the intention is really received by the listener, then the intensity can be felt too. But that involves that the listener gives it the proper respect and attention it deserves.
I would say that the intensity awakens the listening. There is a deep intention there, and that really awakens the listening. I've seen with people what happens that some people it happens communication, when some people doesn't. It wasn't the same that we speak the same language. It doesn't matter how clear and precise the language was, as much as it was deeply the same intention and the same intensity of the intention. They're both sincere and alive and serious about their life. Then they meet, independently of the superficial differentiations. But what can help really that intention to come out?
Well, do you have any idea?
I really don't. That's why I'm here.
Does anybody?
Well, I would think it would be a personal relationship with the subject matter, your own insights into what you're thinking about, doing the best you can to tell the truth about what's really happening to you and your experience of the subject matter. I mean, that helps me be intense about whatever's happening. It's not an idea. It's an activity some way. It's live reaction, interaction.
Yes, well, are you saying that intensity requires some interest in what you're doing, right? Now, where there's lack of interest, there surely will be lack of intensity, but then is there any problem of interest here?
Is it more than interest, though? I mean, it seems to me that we don't see the danger of what we're doing. I mean, that we play intellectually with our minds, but we don't see the danger of what goes on with the mind, actual danger.
No.
Yeah, so what is the danger?
The danger of thinking, of a particular, if I may say, a particular type of thinking, that's dangerous.
Yeah, well, but still, you can't say all thinking is dangerous. So what is the kind of thinking that is dangerous?
It's the self-centered thinking.
Yes. Uh-huh.
It's not the intellectual thinking, the scientific, technological thinking, but it's more of a self-concern.
Yes, of course, the scientific technological thinking could also be dangerous if it's self-centered, right? Which it often is. Right, so you're saying it's the self-centered thinking that is the trouble. Now, could it be that the self-centered thinking also prevents the intensity? Hmm? And also that it takes away the meaning. Hmm? And see, it's in some ways it would appear to be encouraged by the modern worldview, which we say a human being anyway is nothing in the universe, and therefore you have nothing but yourself as a source of meaning anyway, right? Yeah. Now, some people may have said God is the source of meaning, but if God were invented, then it would not really change it, right? See, so the question is, were people really better off when they had these meanings than we are today? They still fought over their meanings, right? The religious meanings.
I think they felt connected, but it was still through a more of a generalized, or everybody had their self-centered thinking together, so to speak. They kind of collected around certain groups of self.
Yeah, so the self could be extended to the group, right? It's the same thing.
But now it seems we feel isolated. Now it's this whole individual, and we're separate. And maybe
it seems more lonely, right?
Which just perpetuates the problem.
But it hasn't really changed. I mean, it's changed in some details, but not at the core, right? Because people felt lonely in the past too. They felt that there was no meaning in the past. You see, if you take Ecclesiastes, you see, there was King Solomon who said, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." He had everything, and yet he said, "Vanity of vanity."
The word insight was used a great deal, and I think a distinction needs to be refined as to insight being objective, not my insight or individual insights, because I wasn't sure as I was hearing people share that it was subjective.
Yeah, well, we have to see what is insight. Is it personal, or is it a group insight, or is it universal? You see, what is the real nature of insight? We haven't, that's a very difficult question to look into.
It's like we want to have insight into insight.
Yeah, that's right, but we're talking of insight into insight then. But you see, if that's what is meant by the word insight alone, you see, we may say this insight, Newton had an insight, Plato had an insight, Buddha had an insight. There's a whole set of insights. But then if we just use the word insight, what does it mean, you see?
It occurs in a flash, therefore it would appear to be sort of outside of time.
Well, we're trying to say that the word insight, if we just use this word insight and don't say what kind of insight, then, like somebody was saying here, the mind has to hold back a little while before saying anything. You see what I'm driving at? And say we begin to get the feel of it. You see what I'm driving at? That's the thing probably none of us has ever considered seriously.
I'm taking leaps. Okay.
Yeah, but I'm saying that many of us anyway have not considered that seriously. And therefore, if you suddenly take this question, you see, just take the word insight. What does it really mean?
I missed. You said it doesn't take what seriously? I'm sorry.
Right.
You said we don't take it seriously.
No, I didn't. Did I say that? I meant many of us have not considered it seriously as yet. Not that they don't take it seriously.
You mean insight?
Insight. I mean, that is, we considered all kinds of insights, saying I had this insight, somebody else had that insight. Particular insights, right? Now, there's a deeper question, which is what is the meaning of the word insight as such? This sort of question is we may want to go into as we go along. Not only about insight, but about many other things.
It seems to be the foundation, though, for a discussion.
Yeah.
To really understand this.
Yeah, but I'm trying to say that usually we have a kind of prejudice saying the particular thing is the most real thing. And we get the general by looking at what is common to all the particulars. This insight, that insight. If we look at enough insights, then we will say, we'll know what insight is, right?
But is that insight, though?
No, I'm trying to say that's one common approach, is it, right?
No.
Then therefore I'm suggesting another question, which is, don't ask about this insight or that insight or that insight, but take the word insight by itself. Now, then you say, what does it mean, you see? But you can't answer that right away.
In vision?
Well, you could call it that, but then that's just a translation of the word. You see, insight means looking in, right?
Perception of it as a sensation, or the apparent nature of it?
Well, I'll just leave you the question with you, you see, saying, maybe we'll come back to it, you see, right? That can you sort of take a question and not answer it right away, but let it work, right?
Because the definition isn't the thing. You
No.
just come up with more knowledge.
No, somehow you've got to see what is meant by the word insight.
It seems like the mind is holding a great weight. Like it's a great weight. When you ask that question, it made me think of that. So
What do you mean by great weight?
a weight, a heaviness, like it seems unable to or unwilling to explore certain areas.
Okay, so we say the mind doesn't want to explore some areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that seems very crucial, saying, I don't know if other people feel that way. Is this a common feeling, or is it just one person has it, or one? Common. So that seems extraordinary. We come in saying we would all like to understand insight and have insight, right? Saying that would be a great thing, right? Especially that big but then along comes somebody and says, but we don't want to do it.
Or we want somebody else to tell us what to do.
Yes, well, maybe we'd like somebody else to tell us, but having seen that wouldn't mean anything, then we say we have a great weight. We don't want, which means what? That we don't want to do it, right? Mm-hmm.
There was something a little, not frightening, but uncomfortable about it.
What could it be? I mean, wouldn't you like to have this big insight?
Yeah, I mean, when we say it just like that, but when you're actually, like with the question, there seems to be something about it that is maybe, I don't know, some sense of that it could be more than you bargained for.
Yeah, you're a bit afraid of it, right?
Yeah.
You see, so we have two minds about it. So now, couldn't that explain why there's the lack of intensity?
So there's kind of like a division between, one seems to want to understand this, but on the other hand there seems to be this weight, so it's like a conflict.
Whatever it is, we also don't want to, right?
Yeah, there's a division.
Mm-hmm. So it's contradiction, conflict, right?
Yeah.
A waste of energy.
Yes.
Wouldn't Krishnaji say that the weight is our conditioning? Wouldn't Krishnaji say that the weight is our conditioning from...
Yes, well, that's an explanation. You say that the reason we don't want to is we are conditioned not to want it because we're conditioned to be afraid of it, right? But then that turns the question into what is the conditioning, you see? Why should it do that?
Is it the same entity that both wants it and doesn't want it, or are people postulating two separate entities and calling that the me?
Well, that's a question. Or is it the same? There's one me or there are two me's? Is there a me that wants it, another one that doesn't, or is there one me that both wants it and doesn't want it?
And I'd be curious to hear what some people think the me is that doesn't want it, a description of that me. Or the me that does want it, rather.
Well, does the me that thinks it wants it really know what it is that it wants, or that it's going to get? I think maybe in the back of its mind it has a little information. Sorry.
I think there's so much mass and confusion in me.
Well, I mean, it seems that you may as well, people want to start talking directly about it, so go ahead.
I think the me
that wants it, wants the reward without having to give up anything.
But isn't it creating an image of what that reward is going to be, which may have nothing to do with what this insight will really do to itself?
Mm-hmm. I think it has an image about the insight, and it has the image about what it would be if it had an insight, and it has images about all of it. And
Well, then you're
and
saying
the images are nothing. And, so I think I see it as the same me wanting all of it.
Wanting what it imagines would be real blissful and ultimate peace, no worries, no more conflict,
And pleasure,
having a great time,
and
but at the same time
absence of
afraid that
pain.
it's going to get wiped out.
well, it seems extraordinary that this one me wants all these things which contradict each other, and that it also wants images which are nothing, and still it must think there's something or it wouldn't want them, right? So how does the me say the images are nothing and yet treat them and yet really regard them as something, right? And not only something, but obviously very important. Otherwise, you wouldn't want them, right? You see, there seems to be a lot of confusion going on.
Conflict and contradictoriness.
Yes, and unclarity, murkiness.
The mind has had an intellectual understanding that images are just the finger pointing at the moon, but it still hasn't had an insight beyond that.
Yes, but it seems if we go into it, it doesn't seem to make sense, right?
No, it's illogical.
It doesn't make sense. It seems a bit crazy.
So then, don't we have to deal with meaning?
Yeah. Well, in what way do we want to deal with meaning then?
How the mind and meaning are one, or how they come together.
Yes. Could you make it more clear?
Well, obviously, I've read some of your.
Oh.
I've read only. Can I make clear what I've understood that you've said? So it just seems that it gets back to fundamentally to what you're talking about, unfolding meaning, and from that we understand. Our understanding is possible of what this insight that we seem to be confused about.
Yeah, well, that's a point that in this book, which is really a record of another set of dialogues that were held some time ago, the point about meaning was raised. You see, but see how we can connect it up. You see that what's happening is that we have a lot of contradiction and confusion, right? About what is it about the self, what the self wants, right? And what is the meaning of life and so on, right? What it's all about. Because you say, on the one hand, would be the most wonderful thing if we had insight, a great insight. On the other hand, it seems that we don't want it, see. Now, I think we'll come to meaning a little later, but it has to do clearly with what it means to us. You see, what does insight mean to us? Does it have one meaning or perhaps some contradictory meanings?
Very simple meaning to me. If I look at my own condition and I say I'm a fearful person and it's a painful process, life is, and insight to me is the potion or the pill. That's going to get rid of all this stuff, and all of a sudden it's going to go away.
Yeah, so that's what it means to you, right? That insight will remove all this unpleasantness and make you really happy, right?
Exactly.
No reason why we shouldn't be happy. See, if it would do it, I would say, let's do it, right?
Why haven't I done it before?
I've heard the notion of understanding insight mentioned by a few people. Is the word understanding related somehow to insight?
Well, it depends on how you use it. You see, it can be used that way by saying I had a flash of understanding or a flash of insight, but it's often used in somewhat different ways, like saying I understand the language, right?
Right. The next question, my question is understanding a function of thought, of thinking? Or is it you understand something when you're not thinking?
That may be, but you see, what are we going to do about that? See, suppose I say I want understanding, I want insight. And I think of that same, getting understanding may be a very high value, right?
But how would that be, how would that manifest itself, understanding? Would it manifest itself in thinking and words? And once I understand something, could I then communicate it to someone else? Or would that understanding be something within me?
Yes, well, you see, that's a question, but how are we going to answer it? We could answer it abstractly and say, yes, it's not thought, right? Suppose I just say, but still, does that say anything?
Should it have to? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I'm saying then what will we do with the question?
We have lots of images about insight. And somehow this big insight, as we call it, because we read Krishnamurti or something, is going to free us. So we come looking for insight. We see that knowledge doesn't seem to do it, so now we're looking for insight.
Yeah, and we may well say this insight will not be thought, right? Yeah, but it doesn't mean anything because it's not actual, right?
It's just explanation.
Because it is thought. To say insight is not thought in this particular way is just another thought, right?
Exactly. We seem to be chasing our own tail with trying to answer the question rather than just posing the question.
Yeah, so if we say we can't answer the question that way, then we're the same. It's the same sort of question as what is insight, period, without any qualification. Or say, what is understanding? You see, is understanding thought? Is there understanding which is not thought? You see, we can't just answer it by a formula, right?
Can we demonstrate insight rather than use words to discuss what is insight? Is there a way to demonstrate it, such as perhaps in a group tomorrow, or one of our groups can do a demo on?
Well, you can't.
You can have props. You can have.
What it looks like.
No, what insight means to you. Because sometimes if you put some thing into it, like for instance, teaching someone about a tractor in the classroom is one thing, but getting them on a tractor is a whole other thing. Is there a way to put you can do a demonstration of a little experiment or so, how this came together with this and created a new thing. That might be an insight.
Well, what do people feel about that?
Well, I'm just saying, if words are just one way of communicating, sometimes insight, many times when you have an insightful experience, it's beyond words. I think we'd all agree with that. So there is part of it that picks up, it becomes real. It picks up a certain amount of reality to it because it involves more than speaking. It was just occurred to me that perhaps in groups tomorrow, one of us could
but I think
a demonstration of what insight means.
You see, I think that the question of insight cannot be separated from the question of creativity. And now the question is, can we demonstrate creativity? You see? Because we have to do it. We have to be creative about our original. We have to be creative in some context which is not set up, you see. Because that's the whole point of it. You see that you can't set up creativity, but something happens which, because once you set it up, then to that extent it's limited. You see, let me try to discuss that a little. We could take, we won't talk about this great big insight, but some more limited one, and say take Newton as a physicist, right? He had many insights, but I'll discuss one of them about gravitation. Now, you can see the root of that was that in ancient times people thought that there was a fundamental distinction between heavenly matter and earthly matter. They thought earthly matter was highly imperfect, and as you went up toward the heavens, it got more and more perfect, and the seventh heaven, it was really perfect. And therefore, there was an order of increasing perfection. That brings in order, as I promised to do. Now, now they said heavenly matter, earthly matter is highly imperfect, as demonstrated by the very ugly, irregular way in which it moves. But heavenly matter moves in the most perfect way, which in the most perfect way you can think of as a circle, right? So they said the heavenly bodies move in circles, and then they observed it and found they weren't quite circles, so they said the nearest thing to circle would be circles on top of circles, that is the epicycles. And they would arrange a lot of epicycles and eventually explain the motion that way. Gradually there arose a lot of evidence, especially toward the end of the Middle Ages and afterward, that heavenly matter is not very different from earthly matter. You see, the motion was already seen not to be a circle, and Kepler said it was an ellipse, he showed, which is rather, it can be highly imperfect, it can be looking like this, and then even then it can be perturbed by other objects, and then the moon had highly irregular mountains on it. It looked just as rough as any hunk of rock on Earth, and the other planets had satellites, and there are all sorts of ways in which the heavenly bodies seem not to look all that different from earthly bodies, you see. So that was part of common knowledge among scientists, and that was in one compartment of the mind, but nobody ever raised the question. You see, the story is that Newton was sitting by the apple tree and watching the apple fall. Essentially, he raised the question, the apple is falling, why isn't the moon falling, you see? You see, now nobody had raised that question seriously before, because everybody said, of course, the moon doesn't fall because of its celestial nature. It belongs up in the sky and stays there. You see, no child will worry about why the moon doesn't fall, because he assumes right away that it's quite different. It belongs up there, right? So but you see, Newton raised a new question: why isn't the moon falling? Well, he immediately must have seen the answer, which was that it is falling. That all objects fall toward each other, towards centers as universal gravitation. And he later explained, through explaining the nature of the orbit, why while it was falling, it was also moving away in the orbit and never reached the ground. So now the point about the insight was, there was a moment of insight there, which really was made possible by becoming aware of the question. Why isn't the moon falling? You see, so from there on, it didn't take tremendous genius to say it is falling, right? It was almost an implicit in the known facts, right? They say if he knew that all matter is essentially the same, there was so much evidence. Therefore, if all matter is essentially the same, the moon must fall, right? And therefore, you only have to explain why it doesn't reach the ground. Now, therefore, the flash of insight was made possible by something very subtle, which is he became aware of he got free of the compartments which habitual thought was in, right? Namely, separating earthly matter and heavenly matter was part of the whole culture to do that. From early childhood, you learned that. It was taken for granted. You know, it was the easiest way to think, and you just did it, right? Now, it's the same. You're not aware of it, you see. The same as you may talk with a certain accent and are not aware of it. If everybody talks with that accent, then nobody's aware of it. And therefore, everybody was saying that, and that was it, right? Now, then he's essentially some very high energy. Newton said later that when he was young, he used to ask questions with tremendous intensity about physics. And as a matter of fact, the whole story is that he was dying when he said this. And he said that he had walked on the shores of the ocean of truth and had occasionally picked up a pebble. It was more interesting than usual. But he said, he was interested in astrology and, not astrology, in alchemy and in theology, right? He wrote more on that than on physics. And so he said that if he had it to do over again, he would now use that energy to ask the really important questions. the point is that he was a person, for one reason or another, was able to question with unusual intensity of the kind we're talking about. And he did not accept assumptions that were taken for granted by everybody, habitually, but he was able somehow to become aware of those assumptions and to remove them, to dissolve them, to see that they were inadequate or false. Right? Now, once you remove that assumption that heavenly matter is different from earthly matter, then the rest of the discovery of the law of gravitation was a reasonable process of reason, right? It required a good mind, but not beyond that, nothing special. So it seems now that creativity, that was an example, I say, of creativity, right? To perceive this new universal gravitation. It turned everything upside down because it made it very clear that there is no fixed center of the universe. The idea had already been suggested because Copernicus had said that the Earth was the center and all the heavens were around the Earth. And then Copernicus said you could explain it by saying the sun was the center, but instead of the Earth. But then this was the idea of no center. Any point could be the center, and everything is falling toward everything as center. So he overturned the whole way of thinking, right? The whole worldview, right? That was with many other insights as well, but that was one of them. And that had the effect of bringing, along with other people, such as Descartes and others, of bringing about the modern worldview that I just mentioned before, right? And which has changed things so much. Now, what was the key point? Namely, there was an act of creative perception there, which required a freeing of the mind from certain rigid grooves of assumptions, right?
Another way of saying that is when Newton asked his question, he was not reaching into the past for it, into what he already knew, or some realignment of what he already knew. He was asking out into the unknown for it.
Yes, but in order to ask that question, something much deeper had to have happened before. You see, why didn't other scientists of equal ability ask the question, you see?
Because their minds were linked in the past.
Well, they were stuck in their assumptions.
I don't think they had the same interests.
What?
I don't think they had the same interest. No matter if they were all scientists, they didn't have the same intense interest, deep interest.
Yes, they lacked the intensity to become aware of and question some of these assumptions. You see, when we talk about the past, that feature of the past which is crucial is assumptions, right? Which are held and taken for granted without knowing you have them.
Well, then, did Newton have a different kind of mind? Or he had, we'll say, an unglued mind. He wasn't stuck in his assumptions.
Well, at least not in some areas. In other areas, he was very stuck, you see, but...
Theologian and all that.
Yes, well, not only that, but there are many ways in which he was a very limited character, a bit mean and so on, but so he was stuck in other ways, but see, at least in that area, he was able to move fairly freely, right?
So it's possible to both be unstuck and stuck at the same time?
Well, at least I'm saying this was not this big insight we were talking about, but it was a limited. He got free in a certain area, more free than other scientists, right?
Yeah, that's good. We don't want to make too much out of this. He did this thing. He asked the right question about that at that time.
Yes, and several other right questions about physics too.
We don't want to deify him.
No, he was very good on certain points, right? But on the other hand, he was very limited in other ways. You see, when he was made master of the mint, because I think the story was that probably around middle age he lost this creativity, he became depressed, and his friends finally got him a job as master of the mint. And he took that job very seriously, and he used to really persecute people. And he could be very mean, you see, and very limited. So there are other ways in which he was very limited. I mean, that's only one. So I'm saying that we're not deifying him. We're just saying here was somebody who was able, it's a fact, that's all, to look at these things and dissolve those assumptions, right, in a certain area.
But you're saying to dissolve the assumptions that prevent us from insight requires a much greater kind of getting unstuck than what Newton did?
Well, Newton had some sort of ability to get unstuck in a certain area. That's a fact, right? More than most people, right? Now, I don't know what to do about this big insight. We would have to say you would have to have the ability to get unstuck in all areas.
Yeah. Well, he had the insight that there's no center of the universe.
Yeah.
Now, that insight, if that insight could be, if there's no center of the human being.
Yes, well, that would be comparable to say that there's no permanent center among human beings as well. You see that the ego is you see, there's almost complete correspondence with taking the earth as the center of the universe and taking the ego as the center of the universe, right? Right.
Prevents insight.
Yeah, but he had the insight. The earth is not the center of the universe, but even Copernicus had it to some extent. But you see, the ability to really get free of the assumption that the ego is the center of all existence is something else, right?
The kind of, well, what you're calling insight, giving the example of Isaac Newton, right? You can, let's say you know that, you've read a little physics, or someone's told you, like, we've been here today and we've heard you, and maybe I can go to someone who didn't know this, let's say a student in school, and I can present the whole scenario when Newton came along, and this was the state of man's knowledge, and they thought that, right, basically repeating pretty much what you've said, and well, really without too much trouble, I may be able to set the stage so that the student or some other person can now have, I don't know if I want to call it an insight or an understanding of the moon is falling, and it's not that hard, in a way, but to have an insight into the workings, I don't know, in the psychological area, seems to be very, very different.
Is it? But that's certainly very different. But isn't this principle in some ways similar? Namely, that there are assumptions in the psychological area and there are assumptions in the physical area. It's much harder, apparently, to question the psychological assumptions. But still, the basic principle seems similar.
Yes, but seems to be for some reason much more difficult.
Yeah, we must go into why is it more difficult. You see, that's one of the questions we can explore during this period.
At the time when Newton had his insight, I wonder if it was so easy for everyone to accept it at that moment. Maybe it took a while to catch hold.
Well, it took a little while, but it was accepted fairly rapidly by scientists because of the tremendous power that insight had. You see, it actually wasn't, I must correct myself, it took longer than I said. See, Newton, in fact, did not publish this for a number of years because he then went over his mathematics and he worked it out and he found it didn't agree with the planetary motions. So he didn't publish it. But a number of years later, I think they found that the observations were wrong. And then his theory was better than the observations.
It seems like he actually saw what was actual. He actually saw what was actually happening. It seems like maybe that's all insight is, just seeing.
But what was he seeing, you see?
Oh.
You see, I'm saying that the mind is held in rigid assumptions that it doesn't know about, right? Somehow Newton got to be aware or sensitive to the fact that he was making that assumption.
Is an insight without a referent? Is an insight without a referent? Is it going to have to be referred back to some reality before we can say it's an insight?
Well, I don't know yet, but I'm saying we're really taking Newton as an example to get into the quality of insight. you see, and saying that the essential quality that we can take from this, which does not depend on the particular incident, is that there was an assumption which nobody was aware of, was taken for granted by the whole culture, and that somehow somebody became aware of that assumption and dropped it. Then from there on, he could overturn the whole way of thinking.
But he turned the thinking in the specific field of physics.
Yes.
He did turn his thinking in the whole of the life.
Because he didn't question the assumptions that underlie the ego.
Yes, but you can see that the effect of the insight was only in one specific area of the physics.
Yes, well, the reason for that was very simple. He never questioned more than the field of physics.
Yes, but I'm questioning how once the thinking of Newton had already an effect by the insight,
Yeah.
it did not affect the thinking on the whole.
Well, because he specifically restricted his question to physics, you see. Now, later on, as he was dying, he raised the question you were raising. He said, if I had it to over again, I would ask the important questions.
Oh, finally, even the last moment, he raised the question.
Yes, but he said he would raise it, but he said he was too old to do it, you see.
Yes, like that. So the question was awakened, raised at the moment of the death.
Well, he raised it a bit, but he didn't feel that he had the ability to really do it, right? He said he was already too weak and old.
Yes, I'm seeing the question already as a seed put by Newton at the moment of the death. And I think a question that has been raised never dies until it receives it reveals the answer, its own answer, the answer.
Yes,
the question itself.
Yes, but the question was, see, there's a deeper question. You see, we have to say that it depends on the scope of the question, how far the insight goes, right? Now, that depends on the scope of how far you are able to be aware of your assumptions. You see, you can't make a question if you're not aware of your assumptions that have to be questioned.
Isn't that almost an insight in
Right.
itself? I mean, to get the assumption, right? I mean, to become aware of an assumption seems to be an act of insight.
Well, I think that's the key act of insight, you see, to become aware of the assumption, which frees the mind to be open, right? You see, that beyond that, you see, if you're not stuck in a rigid assumption, then your mind is free to move wherever it needs to move, right?
If you're living in a particular culture and everyone shares the same assumptions, how do you even know that they're assumptions?
Well, that's the question. You see, take Newton. There already was evidence, you see, that these assumptions were false, right? But the mind has a sort of a rigidity, so it puts that in one compartment, the evidence of the falseness of the assumptions, right, of physics. And in the other compartment, it just goes on with its old habit, you see. So there are two compartments in the mind. You see, that's the way people were working, right? They were not allowing, there was concealment because one compartment was not allowed to know what was in the other compartment.
Are there any tricks that we can use to find out what our assumptions are?
Well, I think it's the other way around. We have to discover the tricks by which we fail to see what our assumptions are. It's through tricks that we fail to see this.
What tricks do we use?
Well, we must discover them, you see, but there are obviously tricks. You see, somehow there must be a trick which allows a certain fact to be in one compartment, a related fact to be in another, and they never meet.
I was proposing that maybe that could be one of our questions.
Mm-hmm.
What tricks?
Yeah, what are our tricks to prevent the seeing of assumptions?
It would seem that our daily life is connected with that, at the points of challenges and points of tension that come up every day. But I think this is where people are hooked on the assumptions, and unless one yields to those points of tensions and conflicts, nothing is seen.
Yes, but you see, when there is tension, then there is tricks to... You see, there should have been tension in scientists' minds when they said heavenly matter and earthly matter are different, and also, but they are not different, right? that should have produced a state of tension, a healthy tension, right? But it didn't. You see, that was part of the trick, how you get rid of tension, which you ought to have, right?
Oh, I didn't mean in the... I meant challenge.
Yeah, but that was a challenge. See, why didn't people see that as a challenge? See, it took Newton to see that it was a challenge. You see, now, see, the point is that the mind avoids challenges by various tricks.
When you speak of the mind,
What?
when you speak of the mind, is this including the brain and the ego, or what? I guess I'm not clear.
Well, I'm just using it in the colloquial sense, the way people always use it. You see, I'm not trying to be very technical or anything. It should include the brain or whatever else, you know, whatever you want to call it. That what we call the mind is whatever it is that is thinking and perceiving and so on, right? We don't know. I'm not going to make at this stage try to say anything more. Right?
If you see how quickly everybody jumped on the bandwagon that the moon was falling, like the apple, what you said, that his insight was in something that was real, gives you kind of a feeling of, if any of us could see, have the big insight, what was real. I mean, we could, all this would then be, would this be as false as thinking the moon was going to stay up there? I mean, and we're all busy being at the point where we think the moon is going to stay up there.
Well, yes, I think, you see, the point is, where our problem is this, that we are at the point where we have evidence that the moon, we believe the moon will stay up there, and we have evidence that it will not, right? Right. That's what's happened with the ego. We said everybody wants insight, but they said, but really, also at the same time, nobody wants it. All right, that should be a tremendous challenge, right? But people generally feel quite comfortable despite that, right? That is, see, such a challenge should make a person extremely uncomfortable, but the mind has various tricks by which it does not become uncomfortable.
Well, it's not the ego that's having the insight, and therefore perhaps it feels it's losing control.
What?
Well, the ego likes to feel that it's in control of everything. All right, the ego is not that which has the insight, and therefore perhaps it fears the insight because it thinks it's losing control.
Well, perhaps so, but somehow, but then you're saying that the ego is in control, so how can insight do anything? You see, what you say implies that the ego is the one who is in control.
No, I mean, it likes to believe that it is and feel that it is and is unhappy when it isn't.
Well, what kind of a being is that likes to feel that it is when it isn't? And
that's the ego.
But I mean, it's not making sense. You see, I'm saying, but you see, our language is accepting things that don't make sense. You see, we can't proceed from there. You see, we have to question it. You see, saying somewhere in that very statement, it's like saying, you know, the moon stays up in the sky where it belongs, but of course we all know that the moon is not different from earthly matter, right? You see that there's a kind of contradiction there, which the mind, see, the interesting point is, how does the mind remain comfortable with a contradiction? Whereas, you see, if you really see a contradiction, you do not remain comfortable, right? So something very strange is going on. You see, the ego finds tricks by which it remains comfortable when there is a contradiction, you see, which seems crazy, right? So if you said, is the ego crazy?
I think that ties into this lady's statements about intensity also, because as long as the ego can maintain itself comfortable, intensity won't be there.
Yeah, but it seems that the ego, the notion that the ego must remain comfortable takes precedence over everything else, including even the life of the individual or the society, or even things which will actually make the ego very uncomfortable, right? So if we say we must remain comfortable and not disturb ourselves about whether, you know, what's happening with nuclear war, the destruction of the environment, but sooner or later something will happen which will make us very uncomfortable. But you see, there seems to be, the ego seems to say, well, we won't worry about that until it happens, right? But
that does happen often. It just tries to get comfortable again as soon as it can.
yeah, but it seems that this very search of the ego for comfort is the source of the crisis, which makes it uncomfortable. You see, there seems to be a contradiction going on again.
Did Newton's ego ask the question?
Well, I don't know. You see, perhaps not. You see, perhaps something else asked the question, right?
But Newton's was much more peripheral, even though you can say that the assumptions that they had about heavenly matter and earthly matter gave him and his culture a certain security. It still wasn't the fundamental insight.
No, but he himself said so when he was dying, right?
So for him, it was much less threatening to contemplate the moon falling and yet never hitting the earth than it is to deal with that ultimate problem of
well, that's why he didn't do it, right? But you see, when he was dying, he said, "I'm going to die anyway. I have the ultimate threat, so this."
Can't get away from it.
But you see, while he was young, the ego projects an infinite life, right? Saying, "I'm going to live forever," right? But knowing that you won't, right?
Yeah.
Again, a contradiction, right?
It seems to me that the question of absolute necessity needs to be raised here. You know, if we could question why thought thinks it's absolutely necessary, why the ego hides behind this assumption that this comfort zone and this ego has to be maintained. And I think in order to do that, we have to look at what does it mean to say I am.
Yes, what is it? Well, the ego says I am, right? And that's a thing we could discuss. I don't know how much further we should go this evening. But that may be an assumption, right? It says not only I am, but I must be, I have to be, right? With absolute necessity. And therefore, and somehow it gets disturbed when there's evidence that it won't be, right? And in fact, there's always evidence, right?
I'd like to get back to this question of people thinking about certain things at the moment of death, because after all, death is kind of the ultimate insult to the ego. It's constantly contriving ways of being invulnerable, and if it sees a deficiency, it invents something to protect itself against that. But when it comes up to the moment of death, there's no escape. There's no exit. And it makes me think of and you had mentioned the fact that people come up with new ideas when they give up, when they're able to abandon old preconceived notions. Now the ego, it wants to have this notion of immortality, and it's confronted with death, and it knows that it's not going to happen. It kind of reminds me of the story of Gertrude Stein on her deathbed, saying, "What is the answer? What is the answer?" And I think it was Alice B. Toklas who was with her, said, "Well, what is the question?" And that brings up the issue: is does every answer have a question? There was. We're just kind of turning the thing around. We assume that every question that we ask about limited things, like Newton's question about why the moon doesn't fall, usually has an answer, and he came up with an answer. But there may be answers that we seek, which there really is no question. We just believe that there is a way of asking a question that will give that answer.
Well, if there is one, then we must ask, why does the mind engage in such an irrational procedure? You see, it comes to the same point again, that whatever we call the ego seems to maintain itself. It seems to live almost entirely by engaging in various forms of irrationality and insanity, and yet it seems to be the most important thing in our lives, you see. And yet, if you try to look for it, you can't find it, right? So the whole thing, the point I would like to leave you with and to sort of consider, is what is going on here? You see, what is this crazy thing going on that people have got used to, and they're taking it for, everybody has got used to taking it for granted, right? And so that we have the assumption that however crazy it is, we're stuck with it. And we must somehow adjust to it, right? And somehow make the best of it, right? So therefore, can we begin to question that assumption, saying that maybe it isn't necessary to be stuck with it, right? But if not, then we have to begin to inquire, to find the right questions to inquire into what is it. See, every question has assumptions in it, and sometimes the question has in it the very assumption that has to be questioned. So when you make a question about the ego, that's what often happens. That is, you make a question: why does the ego do this? Why does it do that? And so on. You see, but it has in it the assumption that the ego is an entity. You see. But maybe it isn't.
Lots of that.
Right.
That happens all over the place. In other words, space used to be full of ether because it had to be full of something. And so they had trouble getting rid of that, although we do this all the time. In the old days, they had gnomes and pixies and fairies and things because these were all unanswered questions. We didn't know what was going on, so we hung a name on it. We created an entity. Maybe the ego is just another created entity.
Well, it may be. You see, on the other hand, it looks remarkably real in its effects, right? So, therefore, it's not such an easy question to go into, you see, to say that this very powerful thing, to say that it isn't. Well, we have to understand how in the world can it exert such power when there's nothing there.
Yeah, and you throw it out, you still got it.
You still got all that power and all those effects, you see.
But maybe we take for granted that we understand what ego is, and we talk about this almost every day. But I don't think we really understand. We don't understand what ego is. Maybe the question we go and the inquiring in that ego. What is that ego? What is associated with the ego?
Yes, that's the question. What is the ego? But that may contain an assumption that there is an ego.
Well, let's put the question, is there an ego or it is not?
Maybe there isn't an ego, you see. We say maybe there is, maybe there isn't, right?
Yes, but we start with the same question. Is it an ego or it isn't? We keep just repeating the word.
No, I'm changing the question, which is, if there isn't an ego, why should all the effects of the ego be present?
Yes, but once we start just the inquiring in that,
What?
that really can help us, can reveal, can help us to understand. It means we are sincerely interested to understand what is the ego, or if there is ego. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother to care to go into the inquiry of this subject.
Yes, I'm not sure I quite get your point, but what I wanted to say was that I think that people here are beginning to feel that it's an interesting question to say, we don't know, is there an ego, there's not an ego, but if there's not an ego, why should we have ever thought there was one, you see, because it has a very powerful, there still is all the power of the effects which we have been ascribing or attributing to the ego, which we must understand.
If we agree to call something real, it's real. I mean, is it deeper? There's a reality to an ego because it makes us jump. But is there truth to an ego? Is that what you mean?
Well, maybe, but then we have a wrong notion of whatever is going on, right? You see, something is going on, something real, But if we say that which is going on indicates that it's coming from the ego, that's one explanation, right? One assumption. But maybe it comes from something else, which we call thought.
Are you also maybe saying in some way that if I ask a question like, why is the ego so, powerful, that already when I'm asking that question, that there's an assumption in there that is somehow that the question has the assumption in it. Oh man, I had this before I opened my mouth.
The ego exists.
Yeah, but right, that very question itself has the problem in it.
Yeah, because it assumes the ego exists, right?
And that almost everything you're doing in your attempts to do something about the ego all have that assumption in it.
Yeah.
And so you miss it all the time.
Yes. You see, I'll give you an example. Suppose you are walking in, you see a shadow, something, a dark region on a dark night, and you assume that it's somebody, an assailant, right? And then your whole body is stirred up, the blood, the adrenaline, and everything, right? And therefore you say, what do I do about that assailant? You say, should I fight him? Should I run? You see, but you may then make all sorts of questions about the assailant. What is his religion? You see? And so on. But you see, once you see that it's a shadow, you see that it's really quite a different problem.
It seems it even requires an insight for you to ask, is there an ego? Since we live with ego as our basic structure, more or less.
Yes, one sees already, the reason I'm asking it is, I say, here is this entity which has such contradictory properties. Now, in any other scientific field where I encounter that much contradiction, I would suspect that the thing is not, that assumption is not true at all, right? Yeah, but here, somehow, we don't do that, you see. So I'm saying, maybe it's not true. I'm not saying yes or no.
That's an exciting question. Maybe Descartes had an insight when he said, I think, therefore I am.
But I don't think he meant it in that sense, you see.
But after well, I went through 3 stages on this thing. This is silly, and then I thought, maybe, and then the last thing was he was right. The ego is produced by thought.
Yes, I don't know that he meant it that way, but
he did, but he was right.
but he meant that thought was the essential quality of the ego, right?
More like I think, therefore I am what I think I am?
No, he wasn't using it as a proof that he exists, but he really meant that thinking was the essential quality of the ego, right?
That's what I meant. That I think I am what I think I am.
No, he was saying the fact that any being which is must have some basic activity or quality, right? So he's saying the ego, its basic quality is the ability to think, right? That's what he's saying. Now, some people don't agree with. Some people say the basic quality of the ego is to feel emotions, and other people say the basic quality of the ego is in the body to feel powerful. There's 3 kinds of people, you see. Some of them emphasize thought, intellectuals. Some of them emphasize the emotions, and some emphasize the physical, right? So some people say the main thing that makes me really feel that I am is when I can do something, right? Another fellow says, I am because I can have feelings. Another fellow says, I am because I can think. You see, clearly Descartes was an intellectual, right?
But even the ones that say, I am because I can think, isn't thought that going with certain amount of emotions?
Well, yeah, he'll agree.
It's not right.
He wouldn't say he has no emotions, but he says the main thing that makes him feel it, my main being is that I can think. That's what he was saying. Somebody else would say my main being is in feeling, Somebody else would say my main being isn't physical movement, right?
But these are a lot of assumptions. We've been raised on this Freudian ego, and we've had that jargon with us for a long time, but never really looked at it.
Yeah, well, these are all assumptions as to what I am, right? So you say, I am, we'll discuss that. What is the meaning of the word I am, right?
I think it precedes Freud. I happen to have grown up bilingually, and the word ego comes from the Greek ego, which means I. I mean, so when I grew up, the words were interchangeable. I was always there. I knew nothing about Freud.
Yeah, well, I mean, the notion of self was an ancient notion, clearly, but Freud said some things about it, but he tended to reify it in the way he put it, right? To make it a thing, right? But to be analyzed. Now, there are different notions of the self. You see, Descartes' notion was one notion, right? Freud had another one, which is not all that different from Descartes. And but then perhaps we'll discuss that tomorrow. What could be meant by the word I am? You see, and the power of that concept, right?
Shall we leave it at that? Shall we leave it at that?
Yes, I think that it's very nearly, we've been here for an hour and a half. It's getting late now.